Well, hello, everyone. Welcome to the Mark Twain House and Museum and our Trouble Begins series. I am here tonight with Dr. Matt Seybold and Dr. Joe Lemak, and we are going to be talking about all things Elmira. My name is Betsy Maguire. I am a playwright and the founder of Playland Productions right here in Connecticut. I was born and raised in Elmira, New York, so I'm thrilled to be up here to talk about that. You too? Okay. Anyone else from Elmira in our audience right here? Oh, that's exciting.
All
Okay,
right, yeah.
good. So you visited. Good. We have people from there, people visiting. That's wonderful. We are excited to present this program to you tonight. This is a hybrid program, which means we have people not only in our auditorium with us tonight in physical seats. Thank you for coming. We have people live streaming with us tonight, over 100, I understand, across the country. So thank you for tuning in. And this program can be replayed, if you like, on our YouTube channel. There is a Trouble Begins YouTube channel, apparently, and you can find the link at our website, marktwainhouse.org. So this program is going to run about an hour, and we'll save the last 10 or 15 minutes for questions and answers. So if you are wondering about something or you have a question along the way, hang on to it, and I promise at the end of the program you will be able to have it asked and answered. So let's begin. I want to thank our very generous sponsors tonight. Our sponsors for the 2023 Trouble Begins season are the Center for Mark Twain Studies in Elmire, New York, and Connecticut Humanities, a nonprofit affiliate of the National Endowment for Humanities, which supports cultural and historic organizations that tell the state's stories, build communities, and enrich lives. And now, let me introduce our guests. Right next to me here is Dr. Matt Seybold. He joined Elmira College faculty in July of 2015. He earned his Ph.D. from the University of California, Irvine in 2012, after which he worked at the University of Alabama. He teaches courses on all periods of American literature, as well as interdisciplinary courses on mass media and economics. Dr. Seybold's scholarship focuses on the intersection of economics, mass media, and literary culture in the United States from the founding of the New York Stock Exchange in 1817 to the 2008 financial crisis. He has been a National Endowment for Humanities Summer Scholar at the Center for the History of Political Economy at Duke University, a Taylor Fellow in American Literature at University of Virginia's Harrison Institute, and a Fathman Young Scholar Award recipient. For a full list of publications, you can visit mattseybold.com. Welcome, Matt. And to Matt's right is Dr. Joseph Lemak. He became a director of the Center for Mark Twain Studies in January of 2016. He has served Elmira College in various roles for almost 2 decades, most recently as director of the Academic Writing Program and the Writing Center. He holds a Ph.D. in classics with an emphasis on Roman history from the University of Buffalo and teaches a wide range of classes, including European history. As a lifelong resident of Elmira, he is intimately familiar with the local legacy of Twain and his extended family. He has already succeeded in deepening ties between the center, the college, and other historic institutions like the Park Church and the Chemung Valley Museum, where he previously served as editor of the Chemung Historical Journal. Dr. Lemak organizes the Trouble Begin lecture series, the Twain Symposia, the Quadrennial Conference, the Summer Institute for Teachers, and the Quarry Farm Fellowships. Thank you so much for being here, Dr. Lemak. All right, so let's get started. Just a caveat, I'm sure most of you know this, but some people may not. When we talk about Mark Twain, we are talking about Samuel Clemens at the same time. Mark Twain was a pen name for Samuel Langhorne Clemens. Sometimes we call him Sam, sometimes we'll call him Mark Twain. Just so there's no confusion, it's the same person. So I just wanted to get that out of the way. So I'd like to begin tonight. Many of you know Mark Twain's significant connection to Elmira, New York, is through his wife, Olivia Langdon. She was an Elmira girl, and I personally have always found their story, their love story, Just amazing. It is heartwarming, it is fascinating, it's endearing, and to me it's particularly endearing because they are quite an unlikely pair. When you see them on paper, they just don't seem like they would have ever met or even liked each other. So I was thinking this morning, let's think about this. I was thinking about modern dating apps today. And I was picturing Sam and Olivia, or Livy as he called her, looking at each other's profiles in 1867 on a dating app and wondering who was going to swipe left and who was going to swipe right. And then I remembered that Mark Twain's first introduction to Livy was actually through a profile pic, if you will. It was a photograph, wasn't it? So why don't one of you get us into the story of Mark and Livy, or Sam and Livy, and where that photograph came from and what happened.
All right, so yeah, I think that's a very funny way to think about it, but I think you're exactly right. In a kind of stereotypical way, Twain fell in love with Livy's looks. Right? I think there's no way around that, right? That her brother, Charlie Langdon, was his first introduction to the Langdon family. They were both aboard the Quaker City when it made its first pleasure cruise to the Mediterranean. So across the Atlantic into the Mediterranean. It was called the Holy Land Cruise because its final destination was Jerusalem. And Charlie Langdon, Livy's brother, was one of the passengers aboard, as was Samuel Clemens, Mark Twain, who was covering it for initially for some newspapers, one on the East Coast and one on the West Coast, but was also in the process of turning it into what would be his first travel book, The Innocents Abroad, which would become a bestseller. And so he was there to satire the passengers of the Quaker City, but he did fall for some of them, including Charlie Langdon, who he befriended. And at one point in their stateroom, he saw this, what was essentially a locket, right, that had the picture of Livy in it. And he took notice of this, and then made a special effort to keep in touch with Charlie Langdon, and eventually was invited to meet the rest of the family. Had his first chaperoned date on New Year's Eve, 1868. They went to a Charles Dickens lecture, and he, their love story sort of goes from there. He was much liked by the entire family from the get-go, but not much seen as a match for their daughter, right? Somebody who was almost immediately welcomed into as a family friend, but who had to sort of work his way into being more than that. And it took quite some effort. So, yeah, leave it.
I think maybe just to bounce off what Matt said, but for that relationship, I think just to talk about Charlie Langdon, when Charlie Langdon's on that Quaker City trip, he's 17 years old. And I think Mark Twain, Sam Clemens, is 27, about 10 years older. And Charlie Langdon's dad is an important person in this character, especially for the town of Elmira, if we're here to talk about Elmira.
Yes.
And that's Jervis Langdon. Jervis Langdon is a wealthy businessman, a very wealthy businessman. He makes his money, I think in the beginning, supplying coal to the Union Army. I could be wrong about, but I think that's true. But also he, in sort of as kind of a monopolistic way that occurs during this time period, very much starts, buying up smaller companies and makes a total ton of money trading coal from the Pennsylvania region, but also timber from the Elmire region, but most importantly, owning the railroads in between. And Elmira, New York becomes a very important railroad center for the burgeoning and growing Northeast. It's in this almost perfect condition to supply the growing industrial areas of places like New York City, Boston, Philadelphia, Pittsburgh, all the Great Lakes traffic. And Jervis Langdon makes an enormous amount of money, doing this business. But at the same time, Jervis Langdon is also very progressive in what that means in the 19th century sense. He's a staunch abolitionist. He's in fact a conductor on the Underground Railroad. He'll use his actual railroads to help transport fugitive slaves, up to Rochester and then up to Canada. He's a very big supporter of women's suffrage. In fact, he's the founder of one of the big founders of our current employer, Elmira College. It was founded in 1855. It was first called Elmira Female College. It was just a women's college. Elmira College, we like to say, is that it's the first college ever to grant degrees to women that were equivalent to men. So in other words, women would get an actual bachelor's degree at Elmira Female College. Jervis Langdon was on the first board of trustees. Jervis Langdon is very much responsible, also at least financially, for the Elmira Reformatory, which was essentially a prison, but again for the intention to reform people, not just to imprison them. Things like the Elmira Industrial School, which was a school to actually help, I think it was unwed mothers, right?
It was, by women, for women, that would usually people who were in homes that were in some way compromised, whether they were abusive or had lost, a breadwinner or something like that. So the idea was to train women in vocations,
right,
which could give them financial independence, whether that was because they had been widowed or orphaned or were part of an abusive family.
Yep.
So, yeah.
And also Elmira Free Academy, which I think, Betsy, you're an
Alma
alumni
mater.
of.
Go Blue
There we
Devils.
go. There we go. And Elmira Free Academy also had very progressive, leanings. And probably most importantly, or just one of the other things, is the Park Church, which is this big, almost cathedral church that's in the Elmira. That was, again, very progressive, which was staunchly abolitionist. So Jervis Langdon had a profound effect on the Elmira landscape. Mm-hmm. And so while we talk about Olivia, and while Mark Twain might be very much attracted to Olivia, I think also it can also be said there's also a subtext that Mark Twain might be interested in the sort of the culture and sophistication and just the money that the Langdons had as well.
Yeah.
Right, so you painted a great picture of Elmira, thank you, during that time, how the picture came to be seen, and who Jervis was in town, what an influence he was. So we have this girl, picture Olivia, she's young, and she's wealthy, and she's well educated, and she's refined, and she's Christian, and in comes Samuel Clemens, who's none of those things, of course. And tell us about his first visit to Elmira. Like you said, he was welcomed in as a friend of the family, because now he's friends with the brother,
Right.
but he has his intentions pretty well known, and I understand there were some letters of recommendation and there were some shenanigans going on in the 2 weeks, I think it was, that he first spent there. So.
Yeah, so he definitely, there is a little bit of a meet the parents vibe around this original visit, which is that he came in with very clear intentions and even expressed his desire to marry Livy to her within weeks of meeting her, which was not the etiquette, certainly for a bourgeois family of the time. And then he proceeded to sort of make a spectacle of himself, all the way down to falling off of carriage and then faking an injury so that he could stay a little bit longer. And so
Resourceful.
at least the way he tells it, yeah.
Right, yes. There's some embroidery there.
There's definitely some embroidery. There's also there's a little bit something stalkerish about his behavior, at least for some for some period of this. And there definitely is a great deal of affection for him because of the way that he treated Charlie on the Quaker City voyage, and Jervis takes an immediate shine to him as well, although I think not thinking of him initially as a potential suitor, but rather as this sort of up-and-coming writer who has a burgeoning celebrity, who is very, very well connected in the newspapers of the time, and so could have value as a publicity man, so on and so forth. So I think Jervis initially sees him as a kind of bootstrapping, interesting figure who might be a beneficial ally, but only after some time recognizes that Twain has intentions towards his daughter. and asks, as was common, for him to get some letters of recommendation. And Twain has friends primarily from the West Coast, from his days in Nevada and California, send letters, which, to at least the way Twain tells the story, to the very last, were all negative. And this is sort of the bond that is formed between Jervis and Sam, has to do with essentially Jervis recognizing that this guy has been a sort of itinerant journalist, a kind of couch surfer for a decade, right? And he very much has to sort of had to make his own way in the world. And Jervis clearly identifies with that. They have some sort of shared, some shared background in that way. And I think at that moment he decides whether or not he's ready to give away his daughter's hand. That this is somebody who he wants to be the person who sort of brings Sam into the bourgeois world, and that's I think
to his credit.
I think that's exactly what happens. Yeah.
Yeah.
And now we have this fantastic house.
Right.
Right
Yeah.
here.
Yeah. So set the scene in Elmira. Tell us about the Langdon home.
Sure. The Langdon home no longer exists, by the way. It was torn down in 1938, the height of the Depression. But I think, Matt and I, Jody and Mallory gave us a tour of the house earlier today, and I think one of the things that struck Matt, this is probably, I don't know, at least it gives us a sense of what maybe the Langdon mansion might have been like. Just the size and the scope and just the grandness of it. There's a lot of pictures of the Langdon mansion, but it's very much in the center of town. It was the heart, it was sort of a commanding presence in Elmira. And of course, when Jervis Langdon decides that he's going to have a new church, and he starts this church called the Park Church, because the church that he was attending wasn't abolitionist enough, right? They weren't anti-slavery enough, so he said, I'm going to have my own church, and I'm going to hire one of the most important ministers in America, a man named Thomas K. Beecher, right? Another connection, of course. Her sister is Harriet Beecher Stowe, right? A neighbor here, and from what I think what the story goes is that Jervis Langdon goes to Thomas K. Beecher and says, "What's your salary?" And Thomas K. Beecher gives him an enormous number, thinking that Jervis Langdon's going to say, "Well, I can't pay that." And Jervis Langdon says, "Yes, that's fine. Let's start the job." And so this Langdon mansion is this huge kind of presence in the middle of Elmira. But at the same time, if you've ever been in Elmira in the summer, it's in the middle of a valley, the bottom of a valley. It can kind of get sticky and hot, especially in the July and August. And so the Langdons decided that they needed maybe perhaps a summer home, a sort of a cabin away. And so they bought a property in 1868 called Quarry Farm. And Quarry Farm is situated on the top of what we call East Hill, at the top of this valley, so you kind of got a cool breeze all the time. So this is going to be a part of our story here too, is this idea of Quarry Farm. Quarry Farm is sort of the getaway for the Langdon mansion. So when things get really hot and sticky at the bottom of the valley, they can kind of go up on the hill where they sort of build this what they think is a sort of a quaint structure. I think it's a nice home. It's nothing compared to this Hartford home or the Langdon mansion.
It's a 4-bedroom home, yeah.
Yeah, it's the 4-bedroom cabin. But this will sort of be an away. So I guess we'll stop there.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So now we can picture Mark Twain. Now let's go back to his fake injury, and now it's time to leave Elmira. But Olivia's going to stay behind, of course, and so a courtship ensues through letters.
Through correspondence.
So
yeah.
let's talk about the letters, because they are. I would love to hear what did they say to each other? What did these two people have to say to each other, and how do we know that? And can we read those letters today?
Well, I think the first thing I want to do is give a hat tip to Joe's predecessor, whose collection of letters is Barbara Snedeker. She is going to release the first published collection of Livy's letters. And so we have long had Twain's side of this correspondence available through the Mark Twain Project. but not Livy's side. And there's going to be a publication of Livy's letters later this year that I'm very excited about. We've seen the manuscript, and it is so. I think it's one of the things that I think got buried in the first half century of Twain scholarship was how important Livy was, not just as a stabilizing force, although certainly that was true, that Livy had a certain kind of calm and maybe a kind of set of bourgeois attitudes that were, that Twain needed in order to provide a kind of balance temperamentally. But she was also really impactful on Twain's composition. She was an incredibly eloquent writer herself, as we see through the letters, and became the first editor for all of Twain's work, essentially from 1869 forward. That whatever he writes goes to her first. And oftentimes there are major changes that happen by virtue of their correspondence with each other, their conversations with each other. And we can see in her letters just how sort of beautiful her prose is and how distinctive her perspective is. And the letter that I always come back to, and I won't be able to quote it verbatim, but I can, that is the responsibility for why we have the Center for Mark Twain Studies at Elmira College, is that on Christmas Eve in 1869, just after he had proposed for the third or fourth or fifth time, I can't even keep track, but on Thanksgiving of 1869, he proposed and she finally said yes. But she had not told her parents yet. And he went off on a tour called the American Vandal Tour, a kind of stand-up comedy tour. And he was in Michigan on Christmas Eve, reading her letters and writing his own reply. And one of the things that she talked about was the way in which she knew this might be the last Christmas that she got to spend in the only home she had ever known. And so,
that's emotional.
It's a very, very emotional moment. And Twain makes this promise, probably slightly drunkenly on Christmas Eve, all by himself in this boarding house in Lansing, Michigan. He makes this promise that she will never feel removed from her family the way he does from his. And it's because of that promise that they start going back to Quarry Farm every summer for 25 years. Throughout their children's entire childhoods, they spend 3 to 4 months every summer at Quarry Farm with Livy's sister, brother, the nieces and nephews, right? This is really the kind of extended domestic life. Far more than it is the case here in Hartford, right, where they sort of are surrounded by family, by close friends, sort of children playing in the yard on East Hill, so on and so forth. Right? There is a kind of domestic bliss that is associated with Quarry Farm, and it all begins with Twain recognizing Livy's emotion in this letter, and that's I always say this is
it's a really sweet sentiment.
This is where we don't have an Elmira College Center for Mark Twain Studies if it isn't for this moment that of Twain's recognition and this promise that he makes and he keeps.
He keeps it. And he made other promises he didn't keep, but
many, yeah.
Many. He wasn't going to swear or smoke or drink, but he does keep this promise to her, and that is sweet. And I do remember that letter, and it is emotional to read it. He was dead serious, and he kept that promise. So they marry in the Langdon home in Elmira. Correct. There are about, I think, 100 people present, and then they move for a short time, I think, to Buffalo. And then to Hartford. So every summer, let's picture this. Every summer they're coming back to Elmire, New York. How are they getting there? How long a trip is this? Who are they bringing with them? And what are they doing in Quarry Farm? How is Mark Twain? What is he writing at this time? How's he spending his time?
Sure. I think the first time that Twain will come at Quarry Farm is 1871. Okay. And that first summer, he realizes that he can just write so much, and he writes the major portions of Roughing It. He writes the follow-up to Innocents Abroad, the family and themselves, were facing some tough times in Buffalo. They had just experienced the loss of Langdon Clemens, their boy. Also Jervis Langdon, the dad. Mark Twain realizes that he likes to write stories for newspapers, but maybe doesn't like the administration, the business side of newspapers, and kind of wants to get out of his newspaper business up in Buffalo. And so Olivia's older sister, named Susan, she marries a man named Theodore Crane, so her name's Susan Langdon Crane. When Jervis Langdon passed away, Jervis Langdon in his will gave Quarry Farm to Susan Crane and Theodore Crane. And so she invites the family up to stay up at Quarry Farm for a couple months. And Mark Twain just decides that I just absolutely love to write up here. He can just find the time to, really kind of concentrate and kind of get away from all the business dealings and all the social engagements. And Elmire is still, at least up on the East Hill, a relatively remote place. It's going to be a very quiet place that Mark Twain can just find is very conducive for him to writing. And let's not bury the lead here, but it'll be at Quarry Farm that during these courses of these summers that Mark Twain is going to write what a lot of scholars think are his iconic works. It'll be the works of Roughing It, The Adventures of Tom Sawyer, Adventures of Huckleberry Finn, Connecticut Yankee and King Arthur's Court, Prince and the Pauper, Life on the Mississippi. It'll be in these 3 or 4 months and sometimes more that Mark Twain will really find the time to really get the job of writing done in a very routine way. Really dedicating these months to his writing. But at the same time, as Matt pointed out, Livy can also be with her family, right? And the kids their growing daughters and their family can play with their cousins. And so there's this nice mutual symbiotic relationship going on. So it's not just Sam writing, it's also Livy, being with her family and Sam honoring that promise that he made to Livy.
I think that routinization is really crucial here, right? That out of the experience of that initial summer when he's writing Roughing It, which I like to say is really his first work of long form fiction, right? He says it's autobiographical, but it's probably a lot of tall tales. Right? There's definitely some things that are in Roughing It that are based upon his experience going west, but there's a lot of stuff that is there, that are humorous sketches that are woven together. He doesn't write a novel until The Gilded Age in 1873, which is co-authored. He doesn't have a single authored novel until what would it be? Adventures of Tom Sawyer. Yeah, and so there's He's not really what we now know him as, a novelist, right? He's not really a novelist during the early days of his celebrity, right? He's a journalist, he's a humorist, he's a stand-up comedian, right? He's a travel writer, right? And it's only that he becomes a novelist at Quarry Farm, right? And I think part of it is that routinization, where he can go and sort of go up to the study. Eventually, we haven't really talked about the study yet, but eventually he has this private study perched on East Hill where he can write looking down over the Chemung River Valley. He's enormously productive in that space, but it's not just that isolation. It's also, he then comes down off the hill, he comes to the porch at Quarry Farm, and he reads aloud what he's written that day to this really eclectic group. Livy's there, his own daughters, his own young daughters, oftentimes children from other families, sometimes neighbors, extended families, so on and so forth. Often a group of, half a dozen or more people assembled on this park, and a mixed gender, multiracial, right, a really diverse audience that he then reads these pages aloud to just after they've been written and rewrites the next day based upon the feedback he gets. Right? And so he develops this writing process that has immediate editorial feedback from a diverse audience. And that's part of, I think, why he becomes a better novelist in the 1870s and 1880s, is that he develops this process where he really learns how these stories speak to people. and to a really eclectic group of people. I like to say that these are novels that, at least superficially, are written for children, but they scandalize adults, right?
Yeah.
And I think that part of that is because of this process that develops at Quarry Farm.
And we can picture him really inserting himself into the town, the people of the town. He befriends Thomas Beecher, of course. I read that he lectured at the reformatory that you mentioned before, 3 times, I think, humorously noting that he enjoyed the audience due to the absence of ladies. But he really is becoming part of the fabric of Elmira, as well as back here in Hartford, Connecticut. So we were talking earlier, we were saying that a lot of places like to lay claim to Mark Twain, certainly Hannibal, Missouri, where he spent much of his boyhood, certainly Hartford, Connecticut, where he lived for 17 years in this beautiful house and raised a family. But I am an Elmira girl at heart. And as we said, he was married and buried in Elmira. You have the bodies. You have all the bodies. You win. You really have the biggest claim. So not to jump too far ahead, but there's another landmark if you ever visit Elmira. We've talked about places you can go, one of which is the Woodlawn Cemetery, which is quite significant for scholars and for Twainiacs and for people sort of to go. It's quite remarkable when you go there on many levels. So why don't we talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, I think that Woodlawn, definitely, as somebody who moved to Elmira, I didn't grow up there as Joe did. Getting to understand the history through Woodlawn was very meaningful to me. And I think that there are several ways in which that is the case, but maybe the most obvious one is that it's a cemetery, a Gilded Age, grand old cemetery that was primarily designed and built by a formerly enslaved man, John W. Jones, who was one of the most notorious conductors on the Underground Railroad and who was very close personal friends with Jervis Langdon, and who they orchestrated the escape of about 850 fugitives over the course of the 1850s primarily. And then Jones became sexton at a local church and then the overseer of Woodlawn Cemetery during the time that there was also a Civil War POW camp in Elmira, and he personally buried 2,500 Confederate POWs, including the overseer on the plantation that he escaped from. And so this sort of relationship to the Underground Railroad, to abolitionism, is very, very deep in Elmira, and I think it's something that we have to really talk about. It's there's a reason why it has the largest black population of any town in the region, and that is because a large number of fugitive enslaved people chose to settle in Elmira either in the course of their escape or came back there because it had been central to their flight to freedom, to the flight to Canada. Frederick Douglass is also somebody who becomes friends with the Langdons, who's also somebody whose fugitive status was aided by Jervis Langdon. And so this place, Woodlawn Cemetery, is literally built by this enslaved man, formerly enslaved man, who then makes his fortune and builds a plantation house of his own, burying Confederate soldiers. And there's sort of all sorts of fascinating stories involved in this, and we won't be able to get into all of them today. But the thing that I would just like to emphasize is that Twain never experienced the kind of progressive, multiracial, first-wave feminist politics that he experiences in Elmira before he gets there. And the politics that you find in Twain's novel, you would not find in Hannibal, Missouri, right? You would not even find a lot of them in Hartford, Connecticut, right? You did find them in Elmira in the 1860s and 1870s, right? And so I think Max Eastman a kind of a Twain scholar, another Elmira native who is one of the founders of the ACLU. He says Elmira during Twain's time is the most radical place that he ever lived, and he lived in Greenwich Village in the 1930s, and he went to the Soviet Union, right? Like this is a very peculiar political, oasis, right? In mid-19th century America. And there is no doubt that it's sort of, not only did Twain find a place to escape and write, but through people like the Langdons, through Thomas K. Beecher, who he befriended, through John T. Lewis, and all of these people, Elmira sunk its teeth into him politically. And this is what Max Eastman says, is right, that Livy Clemens and Livy Clemens' family are far more radical than Mark Twain is when they get married. Okay? And he becomes the kind of writer that he becomes specifically, I think, specifically because as he's writing these novels, this is the culture he's surrounded by.
That's interesting. So it sounds like they had a real effect on him and his writing, and maybe a little vice versa too. So who is buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery in Mark Twain's family, for those that don't know?
Everyone.
Yeah.
Let's see. Well, for the Clemens, we have, of course, Sam Clemens, and then Livy Clemens, little Langdon Clemens, Susie Clemens, Clara, there's like a test, it feels like.
Yeah.
Clara Clemens, Jean Clemens, Ossip
Gabrielovich.
Clara Clemens' husband, their daughter, Nina.
Nina, yeah.
And then on the Langdons, there's a whole bunch of Langdons. We have Jervis Langdon's mom, Jervis Langdon, his wife, Charlie, Charlie's kids, and it kind of extends out from there. But all the Clemens family,
Yeah.
all the nuclear family.
Lots
It's
of
incredible,
Olivias,
really,
lots
when you
of
go there.
Jervises, lots of
Yeah.
Idas. Right? Yeah.
And there is
Susans,
someone who
yeah.
is not buried in the Woodlawn Cemetery, but is buried in a Catholic cemetery, I understand. We haven't mentioned her yet, but Katie Leary was quite a force in Mark Twain's life. 30 years with the family, right? An Elmira girl as
Yep,
well.
that's right.
Wrote a book later on, dictated, but came out with a book where she describes interviewing in the Langdon home, that wonderful Langdon home on Church and Main, with Mrs. Langdon, and Mrs. Langdon looking at her, Olivia, of course, and saying, "So you're Katie Leary, do you want to come live with me in Hartford?" And you can just see how warm she was to this woman, and she does for 30 years. So she also is in Elmira, but that's a separate pilgrimage, right, if you want to go see all the things. So let's go back to the study, because I want to tie this into the Center for Mark Twain Studies and what you all do there, and a lot about your conferences and symposia and the fellowships and all of that.
Sure.
So maybe the jumping off point is, how did you come to have, who owns the study right now? It's so iconic. And then tell us a little bit about the Center for
Sure.
Mark Twain Studies.
I guess we'll start with the study. if you
Sure.
don't mind.
Yeah.
So I'm going to completely make this part up, just so you know. But it sounds like a good story, so why not? And so I always envision that in 1871, and 1872, and 1873, Mark Twain is writing in Quarry Farm. And he's taking up a lot of space, right? Maybe he's smoking cigars, maybe he's having like little kids run by, and maybe he's getting a little irritable with them, maybe he's losing his temper a little bit. And so in 1874, Susan Crane has the forethought to say, you know, Sam, I've built a writing place for you, about 100 yards away over there. Right? And why don't you just go up there during the day, and then I'll talk, me and Livy can talk, right, while you're up there. And so she has, as a surprise gift, she makes the iconic study that was on Quarry Farm, and it overlooked the Chemung River Valley. And Mark Twain writes, I think, in a letter to William Dean Howells, right? He absolutely loves it, right? Just the luxury of it, right? It's an octagon. It's overlooking the Chemung River. It has a window all around it. It has a window even in the chimney, which he thought was great. What didn't work that well, and a couple years later they had to change it, because of course a window doesn't work well in a chimney. But this is the study, this is the routine that we've been talking about. The Langdon family will own Quarry Farm from 1868 all the way up to 1983. right? It'll be continually occupied by the Langdons. It's a living home, right? And this is, I think, a difference than perhaps the Hartford House here, where the Hartford House had a lot of different functions, right? As I learned, right? It was a school, I think. It was some apartments, so it's had a long, varied history. Quarry Farm has just been a home. It's just that. But
One family, though.
in one family.
One
That's
owner.
correct.
Yeah.
One owner. But in 1952, people started to realize, hey, Mark Twain has written a lot of books, and that study where he wrote it, it's right up there. And so good people, literary tourists, started to go into the Quarry Farm on the property, and the Langdons are like, who are these people in my yard trying to look at this study? Also, the study around it, if you look at pictures in 1874, Quarry Farm was very much a farm where there was, cattle and, so the animals, the livestock kind of kept the grass down. As the farm started going away, the trees started to grow up around the study. And you see pictures from the 20s and the 30s and the 40s. You can see that a lot of vegetation and a lot of trees have started to go up around the study. There was instances of vandalism that were occurring in the study. So another Langdon member, a woman named Dr. Ida Langdon, who happened to be a professor at Elmira College, decided to give the study to Elmira College. And so the study, and I don't know how they did this, but they put the study on the back of a flatbed truck and brought it down to the campus. And so now the study, and if you do the math here, pretty soon the study will be on the Elmira College campus longer than it was actually up at Quarry Farm. So it has its own sort of history in that space as well. So the study is kind of, the location of the study is kind of a perfect solution. So while, at least for the Langdons, so while they can still have their home up at Quarry Farm, the people can still have access to the place where Mark Twain wrote all these books.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
That's awesome.
And if you don't mind, if we take it another step further, in 1982, and in fact December 31st, 1982, the Langdon family decided to give another gift to Elmira College, and they gave Quarry Farm to Elmira College. There was two major stipulations, though, that the Langdon family had with giving Quarry Farm to Elmira College. One was that it would never be turned into a house museum, a historic museum, ever, that it would be closed to the public. And the purpose of of Quarry Farm would be a writing retreat for scholars and writers working in the field of Mark Twain studies, and they throw in a couple other authors too, but primarily
It's
Mark
a
Twain
broad
studies. Very
definition, but
That's
yeah.
right. So it's a retreat for scholars, writers, and artists where you can kind of still stay in this living home. The other stipulation, the second big stipulation, was that there would be a caretaker in residence all the time, 365 days out of the year, 24/7. So while the Hartford House is this wonderful, absolutely amazing house, it's a house museum. But Quarry Farm, on the other hand, is very private, right? It's a place where scholars, it's a living house, where it's not a museum, and we don't sell tickets to it. It's a place where scholarship occurs, where research takes place, and we think that people come and become inspired and maybe partake the same routine of the author that they're writing.
And so if you're an aspiring author and you think you'd like to come stay at Quarry Farm, how do you go about doing that?
Sure. If you go to our website, here's our plug. Right? If you go to marktwainstudies.com, and I encourage you to do that because we have a whole bunch of resources there. Right on the front page is an application for guidelines for the fellowships. We have 12 fellows every single year. They get to stay 2 weeks in the house. We also give them an honorarium. You send in an application. All the guidelines are up there. We have a formal selection committee made up from people from past fellows, also from editors of Mark Twain Studies journals, and Matt and myself. We have 3 types of fellowships. Our main one, and our primary audience is academics. Matt and I come, for the most part, I'll say, just we have to prioritize, and our main audience is the academic community of college and university professors. But again, coming from a wide range of different disciplines. So we have 8 fellowships that are geared towards that. 3 of those fellowships are geared towards graduate students, so we make sure that we have emerging scholars come in. But we also have creative writing fellowships, reserved specifically for creative writers. And this year we've expanded it to where we have a fellowship for visual artists. So people can come, again, if you can somehow contribute to Mark Twain studies, but we interpret Mark Twain studies very broadly. I don't think we could define it any more broader than we do. Please send in an application, and we love to see it.
And then you have conferences as well?
We do. Matt, you want to talk about the conference?
Sure. Yeah. The big one that most people may have heard of is the quadrennial. Every 4 years, we host the largest gathering of Twain scholars in the world, a truly international conference that often hails scholars from 9 or 10 different countries, oftentimes has hundreds of participants. That happens every 4 years. The most recent one was last year in 2022 in the summer. Every year we have what is more Joe and My's baby, the Quarry Farm Symposium, which is a much smaller gathering, usually about 9 speakers, and is truly a kind of collaborative event where we have this sort of group of people working on a relatively narrow subject. For instance, this year the topic is Mark Twain and science fiction. Last year it was Mark Twain and was it abolition studies?
Yes, abolition studies.
Last year. So there's a much more, a much narrower topic that we focus on for each symposium, and we have this small group of scholars come in for the weekend, talk about their work on developing projects together. Oftentimes it produces a co-authored or co-edited journal issue, and we've seen a lot of really interesting stuff come out of this. We also have a Trouble Begins lecture series. We have a Park Church lecture series. All of these things, both the symposium, some of the quadrennial conference, all of the Trouble Begins lectures are on our YouTube channel and archived at marktwainstudies.org. We have a podcast called the American Vandal Podcast, which I produce and host, which also follows the no thread too thin kind of idea, right? How can we connect things that are going on in the world of letters and politics today to Twain's work, his life, his legacy. And so, yeah, we do a lot of programming, both in person and digitally. But as Joe pointed out, there's always a little bit of a tacit acknowledgement there, right? That our primary mission, the mission that Jervis Langdon III laid out for us when he gave Quarry Farm to Elmira College, is to produce and support Twain scholarship. Right? And that is the goal. And there's a lot of things that we can maybe do to help teachers and students and the general public and Twain collectors that is ancillary. But at the center, everything we do has in mind, how do we create more Twain scholars? And that goes all the way down to something that Joe created soon after he became director, which was a short story writing contest based upon the tiles at Quarry, the fireplace tiles on Quarry Farm, that is for elementary school students, right? So getting elementary school students interested in Twain's legacy at an early age and giving them access to this, to this local history, right? So we could not define scholarship and Mark Twain studies any more broadly, but we still have to keep that mission in mind, right? That is what created the Center for Mark Twain Studies, and that is always going to be our goal. There's a very different mission here in Hartford, a different mission at Berkeley, out in California, the Mark Twain Project, a different mission in Hannibal. Our mission is to support the future generations of Twain scholarship, to make sure that Twain's life, legacy, work, and world is being talked about, thought about, continuously invoked in some way, shape, or form.
Yeah, And you both do it very well, and thank you so much. That was a great way. It looks like we are right up to the question and answer period. So thank you. I know there's so much more we could have talked about. We'd love to have you, I know, come back sometime. But we have 10 or 15 minutes now. If there are questions from the audience, if you just want to raise your hand or shout something out. I see hands already, so if you would like to ask Matt or Joe something, why don't we start with Al over there? I remember too.
There is, yeah, he has a wonderful line about this, and you don't know how much he is saying this for effect, and I won't be able to reproduce the line verbatim, but it is essentially like, they said to the letter that I drank too much, I smoked too much, I couldn't be trusted with anybody of any good reputation, and nobody with any sense would spend any time with me, right? So it was...
Yeah. I remember two phrases. One was, he was born to be hung.
That's right.
Yeah.
And one was, we'll fill a drunkard's grave.
Yeah.
I do
That's
remember
those
that.
are the ones I remember.
Yeah.
Yeah, it goes something like, I would rather bury a daughter than have her married.
Oh, that's not good. That's not good.
I was wondering, did he ever speak at Chautauqua, which is right near Elmire?
Right. To my knowledge, no. In fact, we, at one of the most recent symposiums, we had the person who's in charge of booking the Chautauqua series was there, and to his knowledge as well, there is no record of Twain actually speaking there, which is kind of surprising given how much touring he did in the area. In fact, there was a part of the sort of romance that Betsy was referring to is one of the things I noticed when I was looking at his early tour schedules is that he would go out of his way to have train stops in Elmira. So he would crisscross, north and south. Elmira was a major train junction, but like he would for some reason he would come through Elmira when he was going from like Michigan to Virginia, right? Like he would find really odd choices, but it was because he wanted every opportunity to stop and see the Langdons. Yeah.
That's fun. Yes.
Can you say something about Mark Twain, the musical, its origin, its
Oh, yeah.
demise?
Oh, good one.
Not much. It was a big. I remember going to it. We have some videotapes of it in our archive. That it was a legitimate Broadway level musical that took. Maybe you can say a little bit more about it.
I think someone in our front row here can talk to it more than I can. Lisa, can you help us out? Because I think you were involved when it came to Hartford.
I was involved here, yeah. It was, from what I remember, it was sort of an attraction to bring people who were not Twain scholars to Elmira. And absolutely enormous.
It was in the Domes. It was called the Domes, this big, giant.
Right. And I don't know how long it was in Elmira, and then it came to Hartford. And it was in our huge armory. And again, it was big. It was a splash. It was, again, to have people that were not Twain scholars, who perhaps didn't know anything about Samuel Clemens, in a sense, learn about his life, so to speak.
But it was very big. Broadway level actors and talent, huge productions.
Ran for years too.
Yep.
Yeah, it really did have a long run, didn't it?
Yep.
Yeah.
And it took place in this what we call the Domes, which is a sort of an athletic facility owned by Elmira College, which is maybe about 10, 15 miles outside of town. So it was an interesting experience altogether.
Yeah. How did you hear of it? Did you see it or?
Well, it's sort of interesting. I grew up in D.C. and then went to Cornell.
Oh,
So I drove regularly through Elmira
Sure.
to get to Ithaca. I watched as Elmira seemed had to Mark Twain 5,
Yeah.
Mark Twain Boulevard, Mark
Yep.
Twain Convention Center, Mark
Yes.
Twain Musical.
Yes.
Sort of a really weird coincidence. Summer we moved to Hartford. We were listening to WSKG, and they said, "Oh, they've sold the musical. It's leaving town." And we never heard where it went. And then we arrived in Hartford.
And here
Found
it is.
So I was just always curious about how it got started.
Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah, that's a good question. Yes. Can you repeat the question too?
Oh, yeah.
And I apologize, Jody, I've forgotten to repeat the question, so here.
What proportion of scholarship has been done on his travel writing as compared to his fiction or his novel writing? And what I would say is not nearly as much, and I would say not nearly enough. I would say the sort of leading scholar on this topic is a guy named Jeffrey A. Melton in the American Studies Department at University of Alabama. But there have been some other books on specifically. There's been more work done on Innocents Abroad than any of the other stuff for sure. But I think it is there are, what I would say is there are many very underdeveloped veins of Twain studies. And that one maybe is not the most underdeveloped, but it is one, for much of the 20th century, Twain scholarship was dominated almost entirely by the books associated with the Missouri River Valley. Right? So Tom Sawyer, Huck Finn, Life on the Mississippi, to a slightly or considerably lesser extent, Pudd'nhead Wilson. And that was about it. Right, that has changed since the 1990s, essentially. But still, I would say there are a lot of Twain's work that is considerably under-researched. And among it, I would say one of the top candidates is A Tramp Abroad, which is a hilarious travel memoir about his time in Europe, literally trying to walk across various parts of Western Europe. And there's been very, very little scholarship done about it. So it's an excellent. It would be an excellent, Quarry Farm Fellowship application.
Wink, wink. Other questions? Yes.
Sure. Both the speakers can talk about how their passion for Twain developed.
Oh, that's great. So he's asking if they could speak to how your passion for Twain developed. Excellent question.
You want me to start? I mean, I'll be the bummer in the room here. When I was asked for this job, I come from the college administration. And in fact, when I was offered the job, I was literally recommending other people for it before my boss said, well, how about you, right? And so I've kind of, while I grew up in Elmire, I've learned a whole bunch about Mark Twain. But at the same time, as I walked through the house with Mallory and Jody, there's a whole lot of stuff that you got to do to kind of keep this kind of center going, this kind of academic institution going, where it's come to fundraising or strategic planning or grant writing or worrying about how the roof is or the drainage at Quarry Farm or X, Y, Z, A, B, and C. And if someone is dedicated to that side of the business, you really don't have that much time for scholarship at all. It's sort of the more pragmatic side of things. And sort of my job is to do those kind of things so we can give sort of the center stage to the scholars. Again, our job is service, right? Our job is service to scholars, essentially. And Matt is the scholar in residence, right? And he kind of helps us kind of make sure that, we're kind of crossing our T's and dotting our I's in the right way, right? So he's kind of the ombudsman of things, if you want to kind of look at it that way. Make sure that, if we're telling stories, making sure that we're telling stories in the right way. Yeah. So while I don't want to say like I have this, while I definitely appreciate Mark Twain, it wasn't like I was a little kid thinking like, oh my gosh, I hope I'm directed for Senator Mark Twain.
And was that you, Matt? Were you that little kid?
I was not that little kid either. And I think, like Joe, I mean, some of it is just being in the right place in the right time. I mean, they were hiring they wanted a cheap resident scholar, and so I had just started working at University of Alabama, my first academic job out of graduate school, and it just so happened that I had published 2 articles on Mark Twain in that preceding year before the job came out, and so I applied for this job and got it because they were looking for somebody who would, I think, start at the entry level and stay, hopefully. And so I did not consider myself necessarily a Twain Scholar when I arrived at the Center for Mark Twain Studies. In fact, I didn't know there was a Center for Mark Twain Studies until I applied for the job at the Center for Mark Twain Studies, which was, I think, a big part of why I got the job, was because I said, we're going to change that, right? That has been my primary mission as, in my role, has been sort of building the interface, the digital presence of the Center for Mark Twain Studies, making sure that, that a graduate student in American literature knows that these resources are available to them. And so that, what I will say about, I didn't know it until I started getting asked this question. But now, looking back, I can see two sort of really formative moments. Right? One was I went to, as an undergraduate, I went to Washington University in St. Louis. And one of my professors there was a Twain Scholar. His name is Wayne Fields, who actually hailed from Hannibal, Missouri. And he taught a single author seminar on Twain. He happened to be my advisor as well. This was clearly somebody who was very influential upon me, who was a Twainiac of sorts. And so that's a fairly conventional. The other is, so my dad was a booking agent. So one of the things that I often did as a kid was sort of tag along with him to performing arts events, ballet, musicals, jazz. His big thing was jazz performance. But one of the earliest memories I have is going to see Hal Holbrook. And it was the first time I ever experienced an audience being sort of overcome with laughter. And I don't remember anything really about the performance except that. I remember being in an audience that people literally could not stop laughing, right? And that there was this sort of surging happening in the theater where people were sort of overcome by this stand-up comedy, essentially. And I never forgot that. And I still don't know if I've ever been in an audience quite like that. And so that clearly left a mark, an association with Twain. I don't remember anything that was in the material that Holbrook did that night, but I just remember the sensation I had the first time ever being in that kind of performing space. So, yeah.
That's a great memory.
And
Of course, he
Matt,
came to Elmire, right?
Yeah.
And I think Matt and I really benefited from coming in together roughly at the same time, and also having the support of Elmira College. Right, Elmira College has essentially given us a lot of trust and a lot of freedom to kind of push things forward. We really haven't had a lot of sort of negative oversight in any way, and if anything, the college has just been supportive of what we've been doing.
I totally agree with everything Joe said. We have been given a long leash to try things out, and that I think I hope has worked as well for them as it has for us. I was just going to follow up by saying, if you want to learn more about some of the things we talked about, we made a podcast episode a few years ago called "The Gospel of Revolt: Mark Twain and Elmira," which features Hal Holbrook in his very last performance as Mark Twain. And so it will walk you through a few anecdotes about things that happened in Elmira, many of them involving Twain, but also involving extended members of the Langdon family and their associates, sort of to get a feel of this peculiar culture that was, I think, very much alive and influential for Twain's work.
And is there a link to that at the Center for Mark Twain Studies?
Absolutely. It's part of the it was originally made for the America in the 19th Century podcast, so you can find it there. But we also have it on the American Vandal podcast feed, and if you just search "Gospel of Revolt," you'll find
wonderful. Great. Yes.
Okay, so I don't have a question, but just a couple of quick anecdotes. I'm a native of Twain House, my education. In the big thing, my father searched for a file, entered it in, rock jump, and there was controversy over But later on, I went to Harvard High School, and I used to sneak out very much now and drop back in and off over to the houses and I'd have these imagined conversations with these things. And so he was always a picture in my mind, and I've written satire all my life, self-talk. I know you talk about academics. I understand. Anyway, so he's been an inspiration to me throughout my life, and I did publish.
That's great.
You know, what you say about really living in Harvard for 17 years is amazing, because in my mind, and I wasn't aware of these time limitations, it's such a short period of time.
We were actually talking about this as we were walking through the house today, and it really struck me maybe the hardest, because this is my first time at the Hartford home, although I've seen it in pictures and documentaries, I've read about it. Obviously, I know a lot about its importance to Twain's biography. But one of the things that really stuck out to me, having spent obviously tons of time in Elmira, but also been to the Mark Twain Project at Berkeley, been to the Hannibal, is that Twain is truly a kind of has a schizophrenic American geographical imagination, right? That he does not belong to one place, right? And there is a temptation, I think, if you're in Hartford, if you're in Elmira, if you're in Hannibal, if you're in San Francisco, or in Nevada, or in Stormfield, or also other places, even in Europe, right? Yeah. There's a temptation to claim him and say, this is where Twain is from. This is the place that is responsible for Twain, but none of us really can, right? As much as I might say, yes, I think Elmira's culture is incredibly influential on Twain's novels, and I think that's true, but there is no Gilded Age without Hartford, right? And without the Gilded Age, Twain's transition to being a novelist would be very different, right? And there is no Twain celebrity without San Francisco and Carson City, right? And obviously, as much as Elmira might have influenced the making of Huckleberry Finn, he has to go back to the Mississippi River Valley, inspired by a speech he saw Frederick Douglass give in Elmira. He has to go back and see the failure of Reconstruction for himself, and have his memories as a steamboat pilot on the Mississippi River in order to produce Huckleberry Finn, right? And so Twain cannot be reduced to a single place. I think that's one of the things that makes him a fascinating representative figure of American 19th century literature and culture, is that he is really irreducible. At a time when most people never moved more than 50 miles from where they were born, Twain went around the world and became the most famous man in the world, right? Yeah. That means that none of us can really claim it.
Yeah. Thank you for sharing those memories, by the way, and congratulations on your book. Yes.
I've worked here for 10 years on Harvard, and it's the fact that he belongs to the planet, because I think Jesus, he's not writing about New Yorkers, he's writing about human beings. He gets how they work, or good or bad, that's how it works. It kind of makes my actual question. This is your first time in Harvard, I've never been to Elmira, but is the farm a miniature of Elmira's environment? Oh wow. Is the farm a miniature version of the environment in Elmira? Because this is known for its very, very progressive neighborhood, and is that what brings Livy? You also make a lot of friends of Livy. So what comparisons are your farm to Elmira?
Sure. Yeah, I think it's a very excellent question, and I think absolutely they are both percolating through Twain's evolving progressive politics during the 1870s, 1880s, 1890s. But I would suggest that the distinction is a class distinction, right? That there is going to be an access to a kind of proletarianism in Elmira, that he doesn't get here, right? That there is a kind of bourgeois elitism, right, that he associates self-consciously with Hartford and describes. Right? And one of the things that he definitely does when he's in Elmira is sort of search out a more working class set of interlocutors, many of them black. Right? I think that's maybe the most simple way to sort of recognize this, is that he's going to make a lot of friends in Elmira that are part of the black community there. And that is going to definitely shape his work. But yeah, I think there's no doubt that both are affecting, right? And there's a complexity to Twain's politics that is a result of this simultaneity of his associations, Elmira, Hartford, but also the broader travels going to Europe, so on and so forth, right? That he is very quick to claim that he is a product of his material conditions, and that all men, this is part of the argument in his philosophical tract, What is Man, that all men are the product of their material conditions. The only thing they can do is change those material conditions, and that's what he's doing constantly, right, is migrating, traveling, right, doing things in order to sort of, what is the quote that's out there on the wall, right? Travel is fatal to prejudice, right? I think Twain really lives those words.
Yes, Tom.
As I write about Twain, I find that there's I guess a struggle that I have when I write Samuel Langdon. You know what I'm saying? Well, wait a minute, I'm writing about Mark Twain. Do I call him Sam now, or do I call him Mark Twain?
Yeah.
I mean, because in my mind, both are like two bulls going at one another,
Yeah.
and you don't know whether to call him Mark Twain or Samuel Clemens. Which one is taking at
Yeah.
this time?
I mean, everybody who writes about Twain fights this battle, I think, and I think I am in the habit of saying that one of the things that you realize when you get into Twain studies is that he's fucking there waiting for you. And he knew you were coming, and he's always one step ahead, and he knows this is going to mess you up, right? And you see that in his letters, in his private documents. He knows from the mid-1870s that people are going to be combing through his frickin' mail, and he starts laying traps for us, right? And I honestly think the name Mark Twain is one of those traps, right? From the very beginning. Like it's not like it's a pen name where he's trying to hide his identity, right? Like it's not like George Eliot, for instance, right? Where this is a woman who knows that her work isn't going to be taken seriously, so she adopts a man's pen name, right? He going by Samuel Clemens, he's sometimes saying Mark Twain, Samuel Clemens on the very same poster, right? So this is a trap that he's sort of laid for us, right? To try and distinguish between this persona and this person who are indistinguishable, right? And that he's sort of playing with this all the time. And so, you can certainly do the thing where, when you're talking about his personal life, his biography, his domestic life, you can say he's Sam. And when you're talking about his public persona, his public writing, you can say he's Mark. But I know damn well that there were many times, and that there are many sort of his friends who speak to this, where suddenly in the middle of the party, he becomes Mark.
Yeah.
Right?
Even letters to him.
Yeah, that
from friends,
he can turn it on and turn it off, and he doesn't reserve it just for certain kinds of performances. He lives the Mark Twain character in private life as well. And so I think everybody who writes about Mark Twain struggles with this distinction and how to parse it. And I really think that's part of what he wanted us to struggle with.
Well, I think he's trying to turn us into schizophrenic.
Yeah.
I think we have time for one more question. Yes.
I'm actually just curious as to why, he spent his last years in
I mean, the short and very sad answer is that he, the happiest years of his life are the ones that he spent between here and Elmira, the 1870s, 1880s into the 1890s. And the series of things that happened from 1895 forward, starting really, we could argue starting with the bankruptcy, but I think it's really starting with Susie's death. It makes it hard for him to come back, right? He never really comes back to this home after Susie's death.
That's right.
And he goes back to Elmira a few times. He spends a few months in 1903, but then his wife dies the next year. And so he says this in letters specifically to Clara, there's too many associations, right? And if I go back there, my memories, and Twain has this incredibly vibrant memory and imagination, and he is able, at least as he describes it in his autobiography, he is able to sort of bring his wife and daughters back to life in his mind, right? And he has this habit when he lives in Stormfield, where you're talking about, of having his biographer play out these songs on an organ, and he just sits there and ruminates about his family, and he doesn't want the memories to be in any way tinged, right? And he fears that if he returns to these places, to Hartford, to Elmira, that he will somehow disturb the purity of the memory he has of his family. And I think that's the sad.
And when he doesn't, as Matt mentioned, when last time he'll be at Quarry Farm will be in 1903, and most of the pictures that you'll see of Mark Twain at Quarry Farm are from that 1903 photo shoot. But yeah, he doesn't go up to Quarry Farm because he essentially says there's too many memories. And when his daughter Jean dies, right, he doesn't go to Elmira. He sends his daughter Clara. He says, I can't even go back to Elmira, right, because there's just too many.
Yeah, he actually
fond memories.
He actually writes about this, the kind of final chapter of his autobiography. One of the things, which is about Jean's death. One of the things he says is, I watched the hearse go over the hill, and then I sat there and I imagined, I know where it's going. I know where it will sit, in what drawing room it will sit in at the Langdon house. I know what it will look like at the Park Church when the people come to see her. They know where the plot will be buried, where her mother is buried and her sister is buried, and where I will be buried soon. Right? It's a dark.
Well, we can't end on that. I mean, my goodness. Excellent question, but I don't want to end there. Do you have a really fun, short Mark Twain anecdote in Elmira? I'm picturing him up at Quarry Farm in Do As You Please Hall with the kitten parades and his daughters running around and the history game he invented for them. Let's leave it there.
Let's leave it there.
Okay. Yeah. They were very happy times. But yeah, that's accurate what you said.
I think that one thing sometimes we give occasional tours. We tell this to sometimes we have field trips for elementary school kids. They can't go inside the house, but they can see the grounds. And something that I always say is that sometimes we think of authors that they need to struggle and feel pain for them to produce, to write. And again, I'm kind of making this up and just throwing things on the wall. But I think for Sam Clemens or Mark Twain, that I think the love of his family and this financial support and this kind of this stable routine of going back from Hartford and Elmira, that really gives him, the impetus and the structure. Yeah. And the support to really, write these iconic works.
Yeah. Twain had so much trauma in his life, but I think you're right that we don't get the very best of him as an author if he doesn't also have that joy, and that only comes for him through sort of domestic bliss, right? Yeah. It's when he makes this family with Livy. Those are the happiest years of his life, and those are also the most productive years of his career.
Yeah,
and I think
no coincidence.
That's not a coincidence.
Yeah. Good. Full circle back to Livy. Happy story, happy marriage. Thank you so much. This was so delightful. So thank you to our guests, Joe and Matt.
Thank you.
Yeah. Thank you for coming. We appreciate it.